Welcome to the Celebration Church Orlando podcast. Thank you for joining us. To learn more about Celebration Orlando, a church devoted to reaching the lost, equipping the found, and helping the hurting, follow us on social media using the handle @CelebrationORL or visit our website, celebrationorl.org.
All good things must come to an end.
That's what they say, man.
Unfortunately. And this Corinth series is coming to an end, except for, like I said yesterday, the chosen ones who are in the Corinth group.
Who's in the groups. And I'm leading a virtual group, and you're leading the group. So
that's right.
Yes.
So Corinth lives on at Celebration Church Orlando, and we want to welcome you to the Celebration Church Orlando podcast. Mm-hmm. This is a segment we like to call After the Message, and it's simply a conversation from the previous Sunday sermon, in this case, the previous series that we've been in here at Corinth, looking at the letter of 1 Corinthians. Pastor Keith, welcome to our last installment this season. How are you feeling?
I feel great, man. It's kind of like sad. I realize the amount of work that this series takes. Mm-hmm. I'm grateful that we've been able to have a different voices in it. You know, we have Pastor Petey, we have Vinny, we have you. So I'm grateful that we've had such a collection of people. But the Keith that was passionate about this series when we started it, like I've only preached in like a couple of them. So I'm like, man, like I feel like I still more to say, but it's okay.
So 2 Corinthians in 2025,
hey,
maybe?
Brother, you know what? You've heard it here first, guys.
Speaking of Petey, he was our last guest on After the Message, and we had a good dialogue, and we just discussed, what he brought to the table in regard to Christian liberty. And I just kind of wanted to give you some space to be able to comment on that as well. I know you and I were, I guess the whole staff, we were kind of discussing the Thursday before, what's Sunday going to look like? What's Petey going to be talking about and stuff. And so I know it's an area of passion for you, just trying to find that proper balance isn't the right word, but the proper way of living, now that we have this new freedom in Christ. But yeah, let's talk about Petey's message a little bit and your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I thought he did a phenomenal job. I mean, he has obviously an immense amount of experience, not only just academically, but just, I feel like Christian liberty really gets put to the test when you're in youth ministry because there's always people that are trying to like kind of, what's the line and how can I get as close to the line as possible? And you're trying your best depending on like your on-ramp into the faith. My on-ramp into the faith has always been very legalistic. And what I understand is that there's some people that may be part of our community that don't even know what I mean when I say legalistic. But I think Petey did a phenomenal job in his message with saying like, hey, this is the line and you better not cross it. And if you do this, then you're going to hell. So that's what I mean by legalistic. So my on-ramp into the faith was one that was rooted in a God who seemed inconsolable. And like, if you do what I tell you to do, then we're good. If not, good luck. Like that's kind of what I was raised with. So everything was really works-based. Even reading the Bible was works-based. Prayer was works-based. So when I got exposed to like this God of love and grace and joy, and I'm like, I didn't even know this guy existed. For me, it became this responsibility of understanding that we are to walk with God with fear and trembling, as Scripture describes. Like again, like the God who said, take off your feet because you're standing, take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground. That God is still very real and he's still very present. But also the God that says, come boldly before the throne of grace. They're one and the same. So how do I hold the tension of understanding the holiness and sacredness of what God's inviting me into, and understanding that there's a lifestyle that should be attached to it, while simultaneously understanding that God provides grace, and there's how many times shall you forgive? 7 times 70, like this endless grace that's available. And so I think that what Petey did a phenomenal job at is making sure that we understand that we don't have license to do whatever we want, but we do have to understand that there's also this grace that when we fall short, there's grace available for us. So I think that's the tension for me is making sure that we are leading a community that always is pressing towards the high mark of our calling. That's, we're looking towards God's standard, and that's our desire, is to live a life that honors him, but also understanding that if we fall short, when we fall short, grace is available. So for me, that's kind of always been the tension. And I think, I don't want to ramble, but I think the thing for me is that we've often approached Christianity with every issue as being a problem to be solved instead of a tension to be managed. And I think if we can get out of the here's the right way, here's the wrong way, and start looking at, here's a tension that we're always going to wrestle with. And if we can embrace that, I think that we'll have more peace.
Yeah, and one of the things that was most profound about even the passage that he referred to was when you're sinning against your brother and sister, you're actually sinning against God, you know? And so it adds a little bit more weight and a little bit more gravity to, well, I could probably do this, but let me think about it twice. Is this gonna be a problem for somebody else? Because I could actually be sinning against someone else, you know?
Yep.
For you, in the 7 weeks that it's been, maybe what are a couple of things that you've personally learned? Maybe it would be in your study or from a message, or just kind of reading the letter to the church in Corinth. What are some things, and that could just be historical things that you learned too, but also from a spiritual lens, maybe some things that have helped build you up throughout this series.
Man, that is a great question, and for people that don't know, I don't know what Nate's going to ask me.
Yeah.
So this is all like we're just going for it.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I would say, as I'm trying to think more deeply on it, I guess for me it's the humanity of it all. I sense that when I would read Corinthians, it was always through this lens of, these people are a hot mess and Paul has to correct them. And here's the correction. Here's the correction. Like, you guys are wrong and here's the correction. But I think I saw in the correction more empathy and love and compassion than I had historically seen before.
From Paul, you're saying?
From Paul.
Okay.
Yeah, like there's this, like, because I think what we see in scriptures, here's how the Bible describes God. Like, it says that when you love someone, that there's a little bit of correction in love. Because if I love my grandchildren, who I just had this past weekend, there's moments where you want them to run free because, hey, man, like, you don't get the chance to hang out with grandma and grandpa. Well, I'm not grandma. I'm called G-Pop. That's my street name.
Yeah.
You don't get a chance to hang out with G-Pop. So I don't want to be the one that's like telling you no, because, hey, man, like, I may not see you guys for another month. So have at it. But because of love, I don't want to allow them to do something that can be dangerous. So do I want my grandson Trey to have the freedom to run up the stairs at the age of 2? Sure. But if I don't put some correction around that, it could lead him to falling down the stairs. So that's, love leads you to correct. And so I think I saw Paul's correction through the lens of love, whereas historically I thought it was, dare I say, a little bit of control. Like, hey, this is what God says. There's the standard. Here's correction. It was more so, no, there's love because there's harm in this. And so I think that's something that I was able to identify and connect with a little bit more this go round than the previous times I've read through Corinth.
Yeah, that's awesome. We talked a little bit about, it's kind of been a theme throughout this series about participation in the work in this great work, and how a lot of times a paid staff member or someone who owns a nonprofit may be looked at as someone who's participating in kingdom work, right? But I think we've really tried to challenge our church that each one of us plays a part in it. I know definitely during Vinny's message, he was very adamant about the fact that, Christ is the head and we're the body and we must submit to Christ, but we're the body, right? It's not just 7 or 8 people who are in the church. Could you talk about some ways or some stepping stones maybe for people who are looking to take that mantle seriously when it comes to, like, okay, now that I've identified, you know what, I am a part of a church. I don't just attend a service. And I want to take even the promptings and the challenges by Paul to Corinth. I want to take that personally to myself.
Yeah.
What do I do? Where do I begin?
I think it starts with changing our mindsets. I think when we look at context, which I'm big on that. When Paul is speaking with such urgency and passion at different points, is that he's urging them and saying, like, hey, we have to figure this out. Like, there are no other options. And here's why I think the urgency is there that we can sometimes miss here. There wasn't the ability to, man, I don't like what's going on at this church. I'm just going to go to the one down the street. That was the only church in that area. The closest one was going to be like Ephesus. Like, there was no, I'm just going to go to this church. I saw their Instagram and my friend told me to come and check that out. So when you were part of a community, you were compelled, like, if we don't figure this out, there is no other option. And so there was a great sense of, like, unity and like relational conflict that needed to be resolved because there was no other options. And so I think we've progressed. We're living in the 21st century. We have the ability to do a lot of things that I don't want to go backwards from. But I do believe that there are some deep spiritual principles that we're supposed to carry through that we've lost, and that is the ability to navigate through these things. And so I think the first thing is understanding that our mindset has to shift, and we have to stop being consumers where it's like, hey, this is my church and it serves me. And the moment that it no longer gives me what I want, I'll just go to another church that has it. The responsibility was always, what am I supposed to do to help to provide the thing I'm looking for, which is why the whole all hands thing for us is such a big deal. Like, I'm called to be a part of what I want to see. When God puts something on your heart, he also puts something in your hand. This is something we've always seen in scripture. There was never the convenience of, well, I'm just going to go down the street. So I think that switching our mindsets and saying, if God has ordered my steps and if God has called me to be here, then what is my responsibility to here? And then what is here's responsibility to me? It's mutual. But I think we have to get out of the consumer mindset. I think is the first thing that we have to get out of. Because sadly, I do believe that I'm pointing at myself, the church, so to speak, we've kind of contributed to the consumeristic mindset. And I'm all about vibes. You know, I love vibes, bro. I love an atmosphere that feels right. I love for people to feel welcome. I love for things to feel intentional. I want things to feel excellent. But I also feel like if it's done with the wrong posture, people can be impressed by your church and they're responding to God's pressing. Man, I'm impressed by this church, man. Did you see their kids? I'm impressed by this church. Look at their parking. I'm impressed by it. And somehow we've become so driven by the things that we're impressed by that we're missing the things that God is pressing us to do.
Do you think there's any recoil or repercussion to, back in the old day, and I think we talked about this on a previous episode, but we talked about how there was pastoral authority, maybe that was a little bit more, there was more seriousness, or you gave more weight and authority to some of your leaders and maybe even some of your fellow congregants within a church to be able to approach you and to talk to you about certain things. Again, as you pointed out earlier, Paul's corrections were done with empathy and love in mind. However, they were corrections, and he felt that he had the responsibility to do that. Yep. It seems to be absent in our modern contemporary context where I can't really go correct another believer. And we were even talking about this in my group last Wednesday because we were talking about the passage where he is calling out the guy who's having sex with his mother-in-law, you know?
Right.
And so we just started talking about a little bit about church discipline and all of that stuff. That used to be a term that was commonly heard of. So I got a little bit of like, what? Church discipline? Like raised eyebrows whenever I brought it up. But,
sure.
But yeah, how do we do this in an edifying way? How do we do this in a way that brings glory to God, and instead of turning people, and dare I use the word church hurt, instead of inflicting more pain?
Man, I think it has to be done relationally. So what's really important with the Church of Corinth, and I know, again, like everybody has their own schema when we say the Church of Corinth. So me saying Church of Corinth, we immediately superimpose our church context. We superimpose our idea of church, which can sometimes be a church of thousands or even hundreds of people, depending on what our context is. But the church in Corinth, it wasn't like a mega church. The biggest church that we know that Paul was very influential in was the church in Rome, which there were several house churches, but it may have been a couple of hundred people. That was like the largest congregation. All the rest were pretty much small communities that were just kind of house churches that were growing in influence before church kind of shifted into the model of like the church temple and all that type of stuff. So I think the thing that we can look at when we consider what you're asking is that for Paul, everything was relational, which is why he could be very specific and say like, bro, like I heard a report from Chloe's people. Like he's not saying like I heard somebody on the street tell me. Like he's saying like, no, Chloe, Chloe, her people reached out to me and told me that there's somebody in the congregation that, like, he's being very, very, very specific. Yeah. The reason why he's doing that is because there's a relationship. Paul says in some of his other writings, and I've always thought that this one was really fascinating. There's one where somebody did Paul dirty. So he's like, hey, man, if you guys are wondering, Alexander the coppersmith, he did me real dirty. So when you see him, excommunicate him. Like Paul was very like, look, I'm naming names. These are people, but here's the thing. The reason he can name names is because these names were people, and these are people he had a relationship with. So I think when we're talking about church discipline, it has to be built off of relationship. I think that we run the risk of damaging people when we offer correction, but there is no connection. There is no love. There is no relationship. It's just me with a microphone and I'm critiquing everybody's behavior. But where there's relationship, then it creates the opportunity that it can bear the weight of the correction that's coming. So I would say that some of my most deep corrective moments that I've had to extend in ministry have always been through relationship. Because it's like, hey, let me sit down and talk with you. Or someone comes to me and tells me something that they've done. And so when we talk about, here's some scary thoughts that may be, depending on church context, people may get a little bit of triggered from this. But the Bible talks about the importance of confession. Now, there's a belief system that kind of like has a system around it, but confession is actually a really good thing.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking about that in series to come, but it's important to be able to confess your faults one to another and how we are able to unburden ourselves. So I have several people in my life that will come to me that I have deep relationships with, and they'll say, hey, man, listen, man, I'm really, really struggling in this area of my life. Here's something that I've done wrong. And there are moments when there's very much like, hey, man, God is for you. Let's get you back on the right track. There's been other moments where I'm like, man, you know better than that. We've talked about this quite a bit. Like, help me to understand how we got here. All of it's built on love, but it's all on the foundation of meaningful relationships. So I would say that that's the key thing. So yes, is correction real? Absolutely. But it's the same thing like with my family, with my children who are adults now. So it looks different, but it's all on relationships. Otherwise, people disconnect. They don't want to hear from you and they'll move on because there are so many influential voices and we have echo chambers, and I could just go to TikTok or anywhere else that can kind of validate my feelings. If I don't at least create a relational dynamic that lets you know that what I'm speaking is in your best interest, then you're not going to be able to hear from me. And so one of the things I learned in the counseling space is it's not just about what you are saying, it's about how you're being experienced. And that changes the paradigm for me. And that's a 2-year journey for me. Is there's times where I felt like, hey, I was able to say what I needed to say, but now I'm growing to understand, but how am I being received? Because if I'm being received in a way that's not matching my heart, then no matter what I've said, there's not going to be any change.
Yeah. We've also, honestly, not in a, explicitly or overtly done this on purpose, but we've looked at letters or we've looked at scriptures as if they were social media posts or as if they were sermons on YouTube, right? I mean, you even like these are letters. These are at least in the case of 1 Corinthians, like it's as personal as it gets, So I think to offer correction now, maybe if the entire church needs correction on something and you know that because you're the shepherd, then yeah, great. But like you said, it's not done online. It's done in rooms and offices and coffee shops. That's where correction or, even discipline may
1,000%.
That's the right context for it, I think.
And I think it's also, we have to be careful that we aren't observing someone's behavior or something that they've done and whoever their oversight is and assume that things aren't being addressed. I think that's another thing that happens in the social context is that we often think that, well, if they're being corrected, then this is what it looks like. I'll just be real, man. Like being in pastoral leadership for probably almost, 15, 18 years now, I've had to sit people down. I've had to let people go. There's been varying versions of it. And no matter what I've done, guess what? There's people that felt that I should have done more or people who felt I should have done less. There's always going to be an opinion about the way that you respond. And I think that's the tension and the challenge of you want to make sure you're hearing from God. And there's like this constant wrestling with God and wrestling with what you think is right and wrestling with the community thinks and then trying to be faithful in all of this stuff by still looking at a person who is flawed, who has made a mistake. They deserve just as much grace as we do, but there may be different consequences based off of whatever the circumstance is. But we have to measure all of that stuff. But for me, I know specifically I'm running in my mind some receipts in my head of like people that I've had to have conversations with, and folks are like, oh, like, but they should have been fired. And I'm like, well, no, that's not what God placed on my heart. And literally seeing people frustrated because they wanted to look a certain way. So I think we have to also make sure that as we're witnessing things, that we're not superimposing our authority into spaces that we actually don't have it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's talk a little bit about yesterday and talk a little bit about eternal perspective.
Yeah.
Now, when we bring up eternal perspective, what does that mean to you? What does an eternal perspective mean to you?
Yeah, I think the concept of eternity is like, it's one of those things like the more I learn, the less I realize I know. And then the more terrifying I realize I don't know anything. So when you think about eternity, it's beyond us.
Yeah.
So oddly enough, and Megan makes fun of me all the time because of like my fascination with sci-fi and just stuff. But sci-fi has been very informative in me trying to wrap the parts of my mind around what godliness is.
Praise God.
So it's been profound. And here's why. Specifically with this one show that I've been watching and this book I've been reading, it's been talking about multiple dimensions. So we're three-dimensional beings. But when people often, different theologians would make an effort to try to describe God, they're like, God is other. He's outside of space. He's a different entity altogether. So ultimately what eternity is us leaving this third world dimension where we're bound by space and time and height and depth, and we're entering into a dimension where there is no end. There is no, and so that still falls short in truly trying to understand it, but understanding that the life that we live now is just the intro track to this album of eternity that when we pass on, we're entering into. So to me, that's fascinating. And knowing that what I do here matters. I think you did a brilliant job at connecting that what I do now matters there is beautiful on earth as it is in heaven. Like that idea, the life that I live now can invite that. So I heard a worship leader once say that when we are worshiping God, it is the closest we get to thinning the layer between heaven and earth. Very beautiful. And so, she was quoting scriptures, but really helping us understand that worship almost lifts the veil that allows us to intimately experience and see on earth as it is in heaven. And it's poetic, it's powerful, and to me, it has meaning. But an eternal perspective is recognizing that what I see is a very limited scope of what's beyond me. I think Paul says it brilliantly, even in to the church of Corinth, like, man, like we look through a glass dimly. It's very fractured in what we see. This is it's dark right now, but when we do see and we get on the other side, we're going to see that there's so much more to it. I'm not sure if you ever seen Men in Black, but there's the one, I'm not sure I think it might have been Men in Black 2, where there's the one at the end of the movie, like Will Smith and those guys, like there's a scene where like they're living on Earth. There's this whole thing, and then you find out like it's just one of the marbles, like this giant alien thing. Like there's like this locker room scene where, as big as the Earth is for us, there's other beings that lived outside of Earth, and we were just like a marble to them. Like it was just really humbling to kind of see like this in the hand of this alien was multiple galaxies, and for us, it's the biggest thing in the world. Naturally, I'm not saying God's an alien. Someone please don't cut this in the wrong way, and now we're being viral for the wrong reasons. Yeah. But when I saw that, I'm like, there's so much beyond us, and there's a God who loves us, and he's inviting us into something so much bigger. So an eternal perspective is recognizing that there's so much more beyond what we see.
Why? That's a hard, speaking of tensions to manage, it's a hard tension to manage, to know that what I do matters, and yet this isn't the only thing that matters, like because we get trapped in our own day-to-day, our own frameworks. It's like when you travel, you realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole lot more to the world than what I consume or what I am exposed to on a daily basis. And it almost expands your mind a little bit, right?
Yes.
So when you're exposed to different things, it helps to enlarge your framework and have a better appreciation for, let's just call it creation as a whole. But what are some things to help our people with what are some things that they can do, or some ways that they can think about life in a sense that not only puts importance on what they're doing, but it doesn't magnify it to an extent that is unhealthy, and it becomes the only thing of importance. Does that make sense?
For sure. I think it's living with a missions mindset. That's something that we talk about and I often reference. But like to your point, when living in America and living in the different parts of America have been great. But when I began to travel abroad, whether it's just for vacations or for the mission field, you get exposed to a world that is so different than us. And you recognize really quickly that the things that we get all caught up about are things that are not even things for other people, or they just don't seem to have the same burden for them. And so when I was looking at something, and I may share this in our next series, so this is kind of like a spoiler, but I was looking at like the American dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this idea of getting, achieving, succeeding. And yet surveys reveal that we are one of the least happy countries in the world, but yet that's literally our tagline. And you got to ask yourself, like, how is it that we are supposed to be this experiment of diversity and happiness and get it and all these things, the land of opportunities, yet statistically we are consistently some of the least happy people when we look at the scope with other countries. And I think it's because we've turned the pursuit of things into the idol. We've turned that into the thing. So I believe when we begin to look at how do we make sure that we manage the tension well of, yes, enjoying where we are, embracing all of that, exploring all those things while simultaneously understanding that we don't want to get so consumed with it that it zaps us of all joy, is understanding that wherever you are, maybe that's God's mission field for you. And so that means that while I'm there, I have an assignment. So for me, things become a lot more linear for me when it comes to being obedient to God. When I look at it through the lens as it being an assignment, like, okay, like I'm being called here. That means there's an assignment for me. There's something that is meant for me to do. That changes the way that I endure pain. That changes the way that I endure disappointment, because I have an assignment. There's something that God has called me to do while I'm here. But when we don't have that mindset, we can become so consumeristic or so capitalistic that we completely miss the kingdom assignment that's attached to it. So I would just say a missions mindset is backing up and saying, like, what is my God-given assignment for my family? What is my God-given assignment at my church? What is my God-given assignment at this workspace that seems like it has nothing to do with God? But what is my assignment here? Maybe my assignment is just to let my light shine and plant seeds. But if we could begin to look at our life through the mission lens and asking God their assignment, that becomes the thing that brings us fulfillment instead of an outcome that may just be out of our reach.
Let's talk about when the ultimate assignment ends. And by that, I mean, let's talk about death for a little bit.
Okay.
Because it's important. I think we are death avoidant, at least in our society. You know, we've replaced a lot of ideas of mourning that have been consistent throughout the annals of time with instead of a funeral, let's call it a celebration of life. We don't want to put a dark spin on something. You know what I mean? Let's try and bring levity to it. And while I understand the notion behind that, I think there is some importance to mourning. And the reason I bring this up is just because we were talking about resurrection yesterday, and the fact that the Apostle Paul himself even says we shouldn't grieve like those who grieve. Yep. But there should be some grief, right? Yep. So let's first handle 1A of this, and that is, what's the proper response for a Christian to grieve whenever a loved one or someone close to them has passed on?
Yeah, I feel like it's hard to kind of put it into a here's 3 ways to grieve in a healthy way.
For sure.
But what I will say is, and I'm very mindful of saying this because I recognize that like grief comes in waves, and there's people who experience just crazy amounts of loss, and it's hard to like even wrap our minds around what that they're walking through. But the Bible does give us like, okay, like the grief had a process. Grief was very much typically in scripture, it was like 30 days of like sackcloth and ashes. You virtually did nothing. You fasted, you prayed, you were very well supported, like people were around you. And then at some point you just begin the process of like moving forward, but they always gave space to express the emotions. And I think the thing that we miss is the distinction between lament and grief. So grief is the emotion, lament is the expression.
Okay.
Sadly, we live in a culture, and I think this kind of connects a little bit to what you're talking about with the celebration of life, is we are okay with grief. People are sad all the time. Like, people will talk and like sadness, but we get stuck in grief because we never lament. That's the expression.
Okay.
That's the outpouring of it. And so what you'll see, that what I think David is an example of, the prophet Jeremiah, who wrote the book of Lamentations, which is literally a book of like expressing their grief towards God. What we see a lot with the Old Testament believers is they were not afraid to unburden themselves by sharing their disappointment with God, their frustration with the situations. Like when Samuel was notified that God was moving on from Saul to David, like he grieved. And then God gave him space to grieve. And then God said, okay, you grieve long enough. It's time to get up. David's waiting for you. Like, get up and get going. So, but there was space for that. So I think for us, we have to know that there is space to grief, and grief is a very long journey, but we can get stuck in grief if we don't express it. And I think sadly, we have been conditioned that the expression of grief, crying out, expressing anger, all of those things have somehow become like, don't do that. God can't handle that. Don't. And I think we've missed it. I want to do a series on this next year, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself.
Okay.
But I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway, that when we look at Job, and so I want to probably do a series on Job. I haven't even told you this, but we're going to do a series on Job next year. And we're going to talk about like the theology of suffering and all the different emotions and expressions that Job was able to navigate through, his anger, his frustration, his disappointment. And then there's a moment when God comes and he comes back to Job, and then he actually goes to Job's friends, and he's speaking to Job's friends, and he says to them, like, man, like you have spoken wrongly about me, because their perspective of Job's suffering was, you did this, God has given you what you deserve. Yeah. So God's correction of Job's friends were, you have spoken wrongly about me. But he didn't say that about Job. But let me tell you some of the things that Job said. Job said, God is treating me like I'm his prey. He's treating me like he's a warrior who's toying with a victim. These are words that Job said, but God didn't correct Job for that. So God gave Job the grace to express his emotions and his frustration and even his disappointment with the season that he found himself in, and God didn't correct that. But when Job's friend said, like, hey, you earned this, God said, but I am going to correct that. I think that's meant to kind of give us a sense that when we're going through difficult time, God actually gives us the space to read David and some of his Psalms. Like, he gives us the space to do it. So I'm not telling people like, hey, man, go outside and curse God. It's great. That's not what I'm saying. Again, don't hear something I'm not saying. But I believe when we're talking about death and the loss of life, is that the reason why some of us get stuck in grief is because we have not been taught on the importance of lamenting and learning how to let it out and be angry and to cry and be frustrated and be disappointed and let God meet us in that space, instead of feeling like we have to put a mask on of faith. And that's where God meets us at. No, God wants to meet us in our authentic space, and that is in the midst of the suffering, instead of feeling like I got to clean myself up and put a Christian Band-Aid on top of it, and that'll make God happy, and that's my faith talking. That's just actually just a mask talking. At some point, it's going to come out.
Job's friends, maybe, I know for me, when I'm in those situations, I really have to do when I'm next to someone who is grieving a loss, maybe that didn't impact me in the way that it did that person. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells a little bit, because I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to be insensitive. I want to be encouraging, but not too uplifting where the fact that I'm annoying,
Yeah.
So it's a tightrope for sure, I think. So if we're analyzing kind of Job's friends, what do you think? And I think this is part of why grieving is so difficult for people, and they maybe don't want to lament in front of others, because it may be awkward. But I think embracing, like, yeah, it'll be awkward. You'll probably have snot coming down your shirt, and that's okay. Not a big deal. Stuff like that. We just don't want to look that way in front of other people. But as far as the people who are trying to open their arms to others and help, what's your best way in helping someone learn how to console correctly and walk next to someone who is experiencing loss?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. I'll be So I'm always very honest. I'll be very vulnerable and honest. So a couple of years ago, my my youngest son Caleb lost his best friend,
Mm.
and that was his best friend, but that was the son of one of my wife's closest friends as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like friends of ours from DC, like we were always together. So like
Mm.
I can't express enough how close we are. We vacationed and all that stuff together, and so when we found out, like the mom naturally tells Megan, I'm sitting there, we're like devastated because he's like a son to us, if I could say that, nephew. And then I'm also looking at what this means for my son Caleb. And so here we are, about 2 years into this. I think we're just shy of 2 years into this. And it is still singularly the most difficult thing that I've ever had to walk through.
Mm.
And I've dealt with all types of loss. The reason being is because my son is so young in his faith. He's probably like 18 when it happened. He's 20 now. But like for him, he's wrestling with, like, this is a family of faith. How did this happen?
Mm.
I'm disappointed that this could happen to people that serve God. I'm also disappointed that this could happen to me. I serve God. Like, so you just see like this hitting him at a level where he's just wrestling with it. And there was a moment when he said to me, like, just in one of his moments of just being very vulnerable, he's like, Dad, I don't see God in this.
Mm.
And I was like, man, I'm like, I understand. And I get it. And I don't believe in what we had saw. God was in what we saw, but God is with us while we're suffering through it. And I think what I learned through this at a very practical level is I didn't feel the need to correct like anyone's theology.
Mm.
So sometimes when people are frustrated, and it didn't get to this level with my son, but I saw a fine line when he was sad and emotional, these moments of him asking, how could this happen? How did God let this happen? Why is this happening? I didn't feel a need to preach a sermon on, but God is with us. Like, it was more so like, son, I don't know.
Mm.
Man, I feel like there are things that are beyond us, and I just don't have an answer for it, man. But we'll figure it out together. Like, it was just being very present instead of feeling like I needed to solve it. And so I would say for those of us who are in community with people who are suffering, even when they begin to veer off the road of how did God let this happen? Why did he let it happen? If you want to kind of be a presence that can serve as a reminder of God's faithfulness, I get that. But that's not the time to get into quoting scriptures and doctrinal things. And I feel like we've completely shut down a person's ability to grieve when we feel like that we have to correct their theology along the way. It's giving people the space to ask those questions and to explore their pain, and us recognize two things. One, God can handle it, so we need to learn how to handle it. I think sometimes we feel like we have to protect God from humans. And I feel like we take a responsibility of needing to, oh no, like don't think like that. That wasn't God. Like I don't feel that responsibility anymore. I'm like, yes, son, this does suck. This is awful, and I don't get it. I will tell you that God did not cause this, but I don't understand how we got here. But we're going to figure this out together. Just being completely vulnerable. So I would say, I'm not saying that that's a prescription of what you should do, but that's a description of what I have done and I continue to do, is just be present and say, yeah, man, this is terrible. And I have a million scriptures in my head I can quote, but I don't feel like that fixes this. And then I've learned more and more that I need to learn how to care for people, not cure them. That's God's job. And so for me, it's like, my job is to care. God's job is to cure. But we often take on the model of curing people and using God in a way to hopefully do that, but it actually just ends up minimizing their pain, and it doesn't produce the fruit we think it's going to.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, that distinction that you provided, care, versus cure. So I hope that's able to help some folks out there. I heard a couple weeks ago in one of your series that next year we would be doing something on the end times.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if it'll be exclusively end times. We talked about this is actually, like, if people knew the meetings that we have and what's on our whiteboards and even stuff that's in the whiteboard in my office, like, so Do you remember? It may have been last year. I said, "Man, I want to do something on the Book of Revelation on the 7 letters," and we were trying to figure out where it would fit in this year. But I feel now more of a prompting like next year's the time. So I do feel like I'm not sure if it will be the Revelation 7 letters, which has end times connected to it, or if it's going to be exclusively on end times. But I do know either way, you can't talk about end times and Revelation not be involved.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I see us going.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I don't know when, but it's happening.
All right, cool.
You heard it here.
You heard it here first. We talked a little bit about resurrection yesterday. Next year, we're just going to go all in.
Yeah. I feel like there's a part of me, because the 7 letters are their own thing, and obviously they're being written during end times, but I really do feel, now I'm talking more out loud, this will probably be more end time specific.
Okay.
Like Matthew 25 when Jesus is talking about the end times, and maybe I'll integrate a little bit of Daniel into that, and I'll integrate a little bit of Revelation into it. But bro, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I've been hesitant in doing it just because I feel like there's a lot of times we can obsess about that stuff and we become weird and we start pulling charts out and look at where the moon was at this time and Jesus is coming back. And I'm like, I get it. He's coming back. What are we going to do with it?
Yeah.
But I do feel like there's a healthy way for us to acknowledge that Christ is going to return. Yeah. And there's a way that we should steward our lives, knowing that I can tell you this. I don't know when he's coming, but we're closer than we were yesterday.
Yeah, that's for sure. Maybe Kirk Cameron can be a member, a guest on the podcast next year. We love you, Kurt.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Any final words as we wrap up our latest season of After the Message, Pastor Keith?
No, man. I think my biggest thing is this. I'm hopeful that it was helpful. Yeah. I know that a lot of things that we do as a church, specifically when it comes to messages, it's that sensitive spot of like, God, is this for me? Is this for our staff? Is this for our church? And there's always like this thing that I have to like kind of sort through. And so fortunately, we as a team are able to kind of process through that stuff. Like I don't sit in the room and conjure the stuff up on my own. But at the end of the day, when we're done, I'm like, man, I'm hopeful that it did what we were hoping it would do. I think that we obviously could keep going and doing more and more, but I'm hopeful that it was helpful. And I would say that I think that you did a phenomenal job at closing out the series. And I should have spent more time interviewing you, man. Like I didn't even think about that, but I should have came here and interviewed and picked your mind on some of this stuff, man. But for me, it's just, I feel like we hit on some pretty critical things. Let me ask you this, and then we'll go, because you asked me a question that I'm like, man, I need to ask you. What is something that you learned, discovered? What's a perspective that question you posed to me earlier? What's something that you think stood out to you on this journey?
I think what was reinforced to me is just how relevant the Bible actually is. It gets a bad rap, and it's just looked at some sort of dusty, antiquated piece of literature. But when you really read it, and you're able to actually do the work and understand the context of the history, and that takes work, right? You have to look at a few extra biblical sources, but man, it's the living word of God. Yeah. And it's just as applicable today as it was in 60 AD Corinth. So I think that was the most encouraging thing to me throughout the series.
Good, man. Yeah. And I'm glad. Last question for you. Yeah. How did it feel preaching on the resurrection yesterday?
It was tough.
Was it?
Yeah, it was tough. I think the concept of it is something that I'm very passionate about personally, and something that I've done a lot of reading on personally. But to be able, and you and I talked about this a little bit, to be able to present it in a way that, okay, so what? Yeah. That's always my biggest thing, is like, I read and listen to the passage 100 times before I preach it, and I'm always asking the question, like, all right, God, so what? I get what it's saying, but what in the world does that mean, and why am I preaching on this? What do I want people to walk away from? So that was the difficult part in connecting the so what part. So, but
you did a wonderful job at it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Eternal perspective.
That's and speaking of eternal perspective, this podcast will live on in eternity, because it's going to be on YouTube and Spotify. So make sure you guys like and subscribe, or whatever they say on the podcast nowadays, to let us to be informed of when the next one coming, and it may be coming sooner rather than later.
That's right. You just never know. Stay tuned.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We love you, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, man. Loved it.
Thank you for joining us. To learn more about Celebration Orlando, a church devoted to reaching the lost, equipping the found, and helping the hurting, follow us on social media using the handle @CelebrationORL or visit our website, celebrationorl.org.